You are now listening to Goldilocks and the Three Bears by the Focused Locust. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a young girl named Goldilocks. She had a beautiful face with blue eyes that sparkled and a smile that shone like the sun. Her hair was like spun gold that fell around her head in neat locks. These very locks are where she got her name. She was considered the prettiest girl in her village, and everyone loved her. She was considered her village's and her family's treasure. She could do no wrong. She would often wander into people's houses and be entertained by them simply because of who she was. No matter what she said or did, she was considered a perfect girl. One day, Goldilocks was traveling through the forest near her village. Goldilocks and the other children had all been warned not to stray too far into the forest. This was because there were said to be terrible beasts there. Today, however, Goldilocks decided to ignore the warnings and traveled further into the forest than she ever had before. She knew she'd be fine, as she'd never been in trouble before, no matter what she'd done. After traveling through the forest for some time, she came across a house in the middle of a clearing. The house was large and had both an upstairs with windows overlooking the forest as well as a ground floor. A very grand house like this must have a very grand people, the kind of people who would undoubtedly love to meet her, Goldilocks decided. So she knocked on the door of the house. When no one answered, she opened the door herself and went inside. The door to the house opened into a kitchen filled with rough wooden furniture, of a kind that a woodcutter might make and use. A woodcutter living in a house this grand? Oh well, they wouldn't mind me taking a look around, decided Goldilocks. Walking into the kitchen, Goldilocks saw 3 bowls of porridge sitting on the kitchen table. Having walked so far from her village, she was feeling absolutely famished. With her belly beginning to growl, she would tuck in and ease her hunger pains. Just until the owners returned, of course. It's not like they'd mind feeding a hungry girl, she thought. She went to the bowl of porridge that was closest to her and dipped the spoon into it. The porridge was steaming and clearly very hot. She had barely had a sip before she cried out in pain. "Ouch!" she exclaimed. "This porridge is far too hot. Are they trying to burn my tongue?" Having been savagely attacked by the first bowl, she quickly put down the spoon and moved the bowl away from her. The steaming porridge had been a big mistake. Looking at the other bowls, she saw one with no steam and one with small wafts of steam rising from it. Deciding that she'd learnt her lesson on heat and that steam meant bad, she went for the bowl with no steam. Taking the bowl and dipping its spoon in, she took another, more cautious sip. "Ugh!" she groaned as she spat the porridge out over the table. "This porridge is ice cold. It's disgusting. Are they trying to poison me?" Hastily, Goldilocks cleaned her tongue with her hands to get the last of the vile substance off it. As she pushed the bowl of disgusting gloop away from her, she felt regret at ever entering the home. But, as her stomach rumbled again, her eyes darted over to the final bowl. She decided that the owners hadn't known she was coming, and that their porridge deserved one more chance. She was, after all, very hungry, and bad food was better than no food. Nervously, she reached for the 3rd bowl and with shaking hands pulled the last bowl towards her. She dipped the spoon in and took a small sip of the porridge. "Ah," she sighed. "Now this is what I needed. This porridge is perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. Just right. Finally someone who understands how to entertain a guest." Having finally found a food her mouth and stomach could agree on, she ravenously gobbled it up, even going so far as to lick the spoon and the bowl clean. Hunger satisfied, Goldilocks felt tired. She'd eaten while standing due to her nerves and had walked a great deal to get there. She decided now was a good time to rest and wait for the owners of the home. She, after all, needed to admonish them on their less than adequate porridge setup. Taking a seat on the chair closest to the first bowl of porridge, she frowned. She hadn't noticed it before, but the chair was absolutely humongous. It was almost like something a giant or a great beast would use. "What kind of person needs a chair this big?" she asked to the empty kitchen. There was no reply. Unable to get truly comfortable on such a needlessly large chair, she moved on. Moving around the table, she found herself at the chair closest to the 2nd bowl of porridge, or rather, the bowl of icy sludge. Pulling the chair with a heave, she found to her dismay that this chair was also needlessly large. It was definitely smaller than the first chair, but then she felt most things in the world were. Regardless, the chair was still far too big for all but the largest of people she could imagine. I guess woodcutters do need to be large, she reasoned. They need to be huge and strong to cut down trees. She decided, without bothering to really try, that the second chair would be just as bad as the first. With 2 chairs down, she turned at last to the chair next to the successful bowl of porridge. Now this chair was the perfect size. Not a mammoth chair like the last pair. No. This was the chair for her. It looked comfortable and roomy. She sat down on the chair and felt herself relax. Finally, some decent craftsmanship, she said, relieved. Whoever owns this chair knows how to treat a guest. However, as she settled into the chair to wait, she heard a loud creaking from beneath her posterior. What is that noise? She asked the empty kitchen, as the creaking turned to groaning. The kitchen didn't answer. It remained stoic and silent, as kitchens often are. Eventually, with a loud crash, the chair she was sitting on collapsed into pieces beneath her. Poor Goldilocks was left in a crumpled heap on the floor, surrounded by pieces of broken chair. Picking herself up off the floor and rubbing her now very sore back, she thought that she must have words with these woodcutters about the state of their furniture. Speaking of, where are they? She asked the empty kitchen again. It held its silence and didn't respond. It seemed the kitchen was not interested in having a conversation that day. Goldilocks moved towards the kitchen window to see if she could spot them as they returned. As she looked out through the window to search, she saw that evening was falling in the woods. It had been a long day of walking, trespassing, and accidental vandalism, and she felt tired. She decided it would be best to head to bed and rest up. Hopefully the bed fares better than the chair, she laughed to herself as she headed deeper into the house and upstairs to where the bedroom was. Opening the creaking door of the bedroom, she saw there were 3 beds in the room. A massive bed close to the door, a smaller but still huge bed further in, and a small bed tucked in the corner near a window. Entering the bedroom, she threw herself onto the massive bed, expecting a nice cushioned fall. Oof! She yelled as her body collided with the mattress of the bed. What is this mattress made of? Wood? This is far too hard, she whined as she rolled off the bed and onto her unsteady feet. She turned to the second bed. It was further in and still large. Cautiously, she moved towards it and sat down on it. Immediately, she sank straight through to the bottom like a stone. The bed was so soft, like a large marshmallow. Perfect, she thought as she clambered in, pulling the covers over herself. This should ease my bruises. But as she lay in the marshmallow bed, she started to toss and turn. No matter what she did, she just could not get comfortable. No matter what position she tried, she couldn't get the bed to feel right. There was just too much give. She sank and sank as though she was going to sink through to the floor, almost having to swim her way out. She clambered out of the bed, breathing heavily after the unexpected adventure of escaping a cloud in bed form. She turned to the final bed. This bed was the smallest bed, and it was tucked in the corner near a window. 3rd time's the charm, she said to the empty bedroom. That, like its friend the kitchen, didn't care to respond. She climbed into the final bed and found immediate relaxation. This was the bed. She pulled the blankets up to her neck as she felt the tension of the day leave her body. Without any more thought, she fell right asleep. Meanwhile, as Goldilocks was stealing sleep in a bed upstairs, the owners of the home returned. These owners were not woodcutters, but in fact 3 bears. The 3 bears were a small family of bears. They consisted of Daddy Bear, Mommy Bear, and Baby Bear. Daddy Bear was a great big bear, the biggest in all the forest. All the creatures in the forest knew Daddy Bear. Even the humans knew him. They were also quite frightened of him. The king of the forest, they called him. Mommy Bear was a slightly smaller, but still very impressively sized bear. She was quite a gifted bear, and it was she who had made all the food and furniture in the house. Finally, Baby Bear was a bear cub. However, as a cub of 2 very big bears, he was no slouch either. No doubt when he grew up he'd be even bigger than Daddy Bear. For the moment, however, he was a little bear. As they returned home and arrived in the kitchen, a terrible sight greeted them. Instead of the healthy dinner of lovely porridge they'd expected to have waiting for them, there was instead only culinary chaos. The kitchen was a wreck. There was a sloppy mess of spilled, half-eaten porridge all over the table. Daddy Bear grabbed his steaming hot bowl of porridge and growled, "Someone's been eating my porridge. Some of it's gone and been spilled on the table. There's still some on the spoon." Mommy Bear also chimed in, "Someone's made a mess of my porridge. Look, some of mine is gone and has been spat all over the table. This is disgusting. Who would do such a thing?" Baby Bear went around to the third bowl of porridge and let out a cry. "Someone's eaten my porridge. They ate all of it. They even licked the spoon and the bowl clean. It's all gone. I'm so hungry. Who would steal my dinner?" Gazing around at the rest of the kitchen, Daddy Bear growled even louder. "Someone's been using my chair. It's been moved," he rumbled. Mama Bear went to her chair and saw it had been moved as well. "Someone's used my chair as well. What's going on? Who did this?" she called out to the unresponsive kitchen. Baby Bear, meanwhile, was gazing at the ruins of his beloved chair and beginning to cry. "My chair! Why? It's destroyed. Someone has smashed it to bits. Who would do this?" he sobbed. "They've eaten my dinner and broken my chair. This is awful." Seeing the state their son was in, his parents held him close. Holding each other, they gazed at the wreckage of their once happy kitchen. Who could do such a thing? Why would someone come in and destroy their happiness? What sort of monster had they angered? Baby Bear was crying, and Mommy Bear began to join him. Their home had been ruined. Seeing the state his family was in, Daddy Bear was filled with a sense of wrongness and rage. His body tensed as a great roar rumbled from deep within his belly, up through his throat and out through his mouth. His deep, angry voice echoed out through the house and into the forest, scattering all sorts of creatures everywhere. When the echo faded, there wasn't so much as a bug near the house. They'd all fled. As they held each other close and wondered who could do this to them, they heard a noise from above. The bedroom. Maybe the intruders were still there. Maybe they'd never left. As those thoughts crossed their minds, the bears turned to each other and nodded. Almost as one, they moved towards the staircase and began climbing it. When they arrived in the bedroom, they saw further disarray. Daddy Bear ran to his hard wooden bed, perfect for a large bear such as himself, and seeing the ruffled covers let out a growl. "Someone's been sleeping in my bed," he grumbled. Mommy Bear, seeing the disaster that was her comfortable soft bed, let out a small roar. "Someone's been sleeping in my bed too," she cried. "Everything's a complete mess. Look at the covers." Having checked the other two beds, they finally turned to the third bed. Baby Bear was already beside it. He stared at the massive blankets on top of his bed with a murderous expression. "I think someone is sleeping in my bed," he growled softly. Hearing this, Mommy Bear and Daddy Bear both approached the bed as well. With all three bears surrounding it, Daddy Bear ripped the covers off. What he found there surprised him and his family completely. She had awoken to the sound of roaring, a deep sound that raised the hairs on her arms and made her stomach turn cold with fear. A deep primal fear like a caveman fearing the night. There was nothing remotely human in that roar. It was the sound of a beast. An angry beast. The rage of a king finding a thief in his castle. The echoes of it reverberated in her skull in time to her own thunderous heartbeat. Her new bed was drenched in sweat and the damp sheets clung tight to her as she shivered. Goldilocks needed to escape. She had to get up. If she stayed where she was dead. She needed to move, and fast. She tried to move her arms, but they were frozen. Every sinew and muscle of her arms were locked tight. Her hands clutched the covers in a death grip. Her legs were paralyzed. They were 2 planks of aged wood below her torso instead of her limbs. Not so much as a toe wiggle was happening, no matter how much she tried. She shifted her eyes around the room to see if she could see anything to help her. She got a glimpse of the failing light coming through the top of the window at the edge of her vision. She turned her head with all her strength, and creaking like a rusty hinge, her head slowly turned towards the window. She could see outside. The window wasn't big, but it was big enough for her to get through. It was also probably too small for the monster that roared. She shivered again, remembering the noise from earlier. It was going to be fine. She could see the window. She could get out through the window. She was going to be fine. She just needed to get out of bed without making noise so the monster didn't notice her. She could do that. She summoned her willpower and moved an arm, unclenching the covers and inching it out from beneath. Her heart was hammering. It was deafening. Amid the noise, she gasped as one arm flopped free. Her breath was gone. She felt like she'd run a marathon. She tried to calm her breathing. "Don't panic. You can do this," she told herself. That was an arm free. She was nearly there. That was only an arm free. She was going to die. She thought she heard another noise from below. Was it coming up the stairs? She didn't have time to check or to panic. She needed to move now. Her terror turned from restraint to fuel as she ripped the covers off her with her free hand and rolled out of the bed. She was going to be fine. She needed to move quickly but quietly. Too slow and she wouldn't escape in time. Too loud and it might hear her. She levered herself off the bed as gracefully as her shaking hands would allow, her feet meeting the floor with a soft pat. She stood quietly but quicker now and moved towards the window. Each step was a new ordeal as each of her legs seemed to creak like an old mill as she moved forward. She moved nervously towards the window until she finally lurched against it. The glass cooled down her feverish head. The sweat poured out of her and her nerves were fried, but she had finally made it to her salvation. Outside she could see the sky and the forest. Freedom, just out of reach. The window opened onto the slanted roof of the house, but that was fine. Even being on the roof gave her options. If she stayed in the room, she wouldn't even be able to hide under the beds, as it was solid wood from mattress to floor. In here, she could only hide under the covers and pray she didn't die. At least with a roof she could move. There was probably some planks she could use to climb down the house. She was going to make it. She was going to be fine. With a hushed phew, she wiped some of the sweat from her hands and turned the handle of the window. Outward and into freedom from this nightmare. Click. The handle had stopped before turning fully. She tried it again. Click. She started to panic. This couldn't be happening. Click. Her eyes swam and she started to breathe heavier. No, this isn't fair. Click. She tried again, even harder this time. Click. More forcefully. Click. Faster. Click. Over and over again. Click. 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 She started wrenching her hands against the handle, letting it bite into her skin as she threw her full body against the lock. Click. With a final desperate heave, she threw everything against it, trying to ram the lock open with all of her fear and might. She poured out all of her strength and felt the handle turn once more. She could feel it. The lock was going to give. This time she would be able to escape. Click. Her knees gave way as she collapsed into a puddle of sweat and tears as she sobbed, exhausted on the ground. Defeated by a window lock, she looked up at the window in despair and had another idea. Maybe she could smash the window open. The noise would attract it from below, but that wouldn't matter if she made it out. She picked herself off the ground and steadied herself a distance from the window. She ran and tried to slam her body into the window, but all that happened was she bounced off and made a loud noise as she hit the floor. It hadn't hurt her, had it? She still had one more chance. She lifted herself and prepared to slam herself into the window again. However, right before she could slam herself, she heard it. Movement from below. From the bottom of the stairs, the noise of something large moving. It was over. Her time had run out. She could hear it beginning to come up the stairs, the dreadful steps rumbling through the house. Each step was another tick of the clock moving ever closer to her death. There could be no escape now. She just needed to hide and hope. She looked around the room again, hoping to see something she'd missed. Perhaps a closet would magically appear and she could dive into it. No such luck. A bare room with 3 beds. Each bed was solid to the floor with wood. The only place she could hide was in a bed. She just needed to choose one. Not the big bed. That had to be the monster's. She'd definitely be found if she hid there. It'd be the first place to be checked. Not the middle bed. Its rumpled covers were too thin to hide her. She'd stick out like a sore thumb in it. The small bed. The one she'd slept in. Its covers were thick. Maybe the monster wouldn't notice. The rumbling from the staircase made it outside the door. She needed to go now. As quickly as she could, she dove into the small bed, barely having time to pull the covers over her before she heard the door open. She was shaking like a leaf. Hopefully the bed wasn't shaking as well. She covered her mouth to try and hide the sound of her breathing as she heard the creaking from the door as it entered. She heard the growl as the large bed was inspected, deep and menacing, a growl of pure rage. She had made the right call. She could make it out of this. She felt the floor shake as it moved to the next bed. A different growl came out. Still terrifying, but less deep. There was less bass in this growl. It shook her to the pit of her stomach rather than her soul. This was a different growl. The realization struck her and she screamed silently into her hand. A different growl from a different monster. There wasn't one thing here. There were several. 3 chairs, 3 bowls, 3 beds, 3 monsters. Which meant that whatever one was third was going to come to where she was hiding anyway. As this thought crossed her mind, she stopped. There was a presence next to the bed. She hadn't felt the floor shake. She had barely registered its advance in the back of her mind as she was reeling with the shocking realization. She tried to hold still as a more high-pitched, but softer, younger growl assaulted her from all too close. It was right next to her. The floor shook as the other monsters drew around the bed. Her mind and body both completely froze stiff. Her mind went completely blank as all thought faded away. There was no escape. She felt what little control she had of her own body fade as the covers were wrenched from overhead. She blinked a few times to clear the sudden light from her eyes. There they were, 3 bears. As her eyes flicked between them, they briefly met the largest bear. It was huge, like a firm mountain. Its eyes met hers. There was no humanity there. There was no mercy. That was the angry eye of a predator staring at prey. Suddenly, its head moved close and its eyes were replaced with a mouth. The mouth snapped open directly before her own eyes, revealing the daggers it had for teeth and unleashing an awful smell of blood and death into her face. As the gaping maw of the bear stretched before her face, Goldilocks' life flashed before her eyes. She saw her family, her mother, her father, her siblings, her friends from the village. She saw every kind neighbor whose house she had visited. She saw every merchant who had playfully ruffled her head. She saw every festival and celebration, every dance and every song. She saw it all. She saw everything she'd ever hoped for, everything she'd ever dreamed. That single moment seemed to stretch on into forever. Then the moment was over, and there was just the darkness of the bear's mouth. Then nothing. Later, in the now cleaned kitchen, the bear sat around the dinner table chatting. Daddy Bear looked at his well-fed family and cleaned the last of the blood from his fur. He let out a hearty chuckle. "Well, there's one thing I say for sure," he rumbled happily. "Tasty as she was no bowl of porridge." Mommy Bear and Baby Bear both laughed at Daddy Bear's joke. Happiness and peace had finally been restored to their home. All was right and normal again for the Bear family as they continued living happily throughout the rest of their days. The end.